Hey, this is Chris, and in this video I'm going to be reviewing 5 of the most popular ASX listed ETFs that cover the broad Australian share market. And this is one of the most competitive categories when it comes to ETFs because there's so much money tracking it. And I'm going to be comparing the 5 most popular across a range of different metrics. So first of all, the size of the ETFs, second, the costs, the liquidity, the slippage, and then the returns. So the 5 ETFs I'm going to be comparing is STW, the Spider S&P ASX 200 ETF, VAS, the Vanguard Australian Shares Index ETF, IOZ, which is the iShares Core S&P ASX 200 ETF, MVW, the VanEck Vectors Australian Equal Weight ETF, and A200, the BetaShares Australian 200 ETF. So first of all, on size. Now, there is a lot of money going into these ETFs. I would say broadly, there's been a huge amount of growth over the last 10 years. One of the interesting trends we've seen is that the initial leader in this space, which was the STW Spider ASX 200 ETF, which was a stalwart. It was one of the first ETFs in Australia and certainly the first Australian shares ETF. It was overtaken a few years ago in 2018 by the Vanguard Australian Shares Index ETF. And the Vanguard ETF has continued to take ground off the STW ETF. The Vanguard ETF now has 8.8 billion under management, whereas the S&P version, the Spider version, actually only has 4.7 billion under management, and the others all have smaller than that, 1, 2, 3 billion under management. So overall, they're all pretty big. You can be pretty confident they're all going to stick around and they're all pretty reliable, but the Vanguard ETF does have the most under management and is probably soon going to crack $10 billion under management. The next metric I'm going to be looking at is costs. Now, costs are obviously important. One of the reasons ETFs are so appealing, and particularly these diversified ETFs, is that they have much lower costs than a typical active fund that might be charging 1 or 1.5% per year. And that's why almost all of these ETFs have outperformed the average active manager over time because their costs are so much lower. And what we see is there's been a lot of cost pressure, particularly in this category, over the last few years, as everyone has wanted to come out in market as having the cheapest or lowest fee Australian shares ETF. Now, at the moment, the lowest fee ETF out there is the BetaShares ETF, the BetaShares Australian 200 ETF, which came out with a very aggressive 7 basis point fee. And they were able to achieve this because they used a different index provider. So they went to Solo Active, a German ETF index provider, rather than going to the traditional S&P or MSCI or FTSE, and that allowed them to save costs, which they can pass on to consumers. There are some small risks here because it's a new index that's only been created by a new index creator. But that said, it's a fantastic product that gives people access to Australian shares for a very low cost. Then there's a few others that are still under 10 basis points. So there's the IOZ iShares version at 9 basis points and the VAS Vanguard version at 10 basis points. A few a bit more high, a bit higher than that. STW, although it was the first, it hasn't been as aggressive on pricing. It's come down from 29 a few years ago, gradually to 13 basis points. So it comes in 4th. And finally, the VanEck version, which is a equal weight ETF. It has slightly higher costs at 35 basis points. But obviously it's appealing to some people who want to spread their money across shares in an equal weight fashion, which means you're taking weight out of the biggest large caps and putting it into small caps. And it makes this ETF act a bit more like a small cap type ETF because your exposure is more focused on those small cap shares. So the next couple of metrics I'm going to be comparing is slippage and liquidity, and these are both important for slightly different reasons. Slippage is how much you pay when you're crossing spreads getting into an ETF. You want this to be as low as possible so you're losing out less when you get in and out. And then there's liquidity. This is how much is trading in these ETFs on a month-to-month basis. The more liquidity, the better it is for you getting in and out at a great price and not relying on market makers in order to get in and out of an ETF. So first of all, on slippage, now I would say generally these Australian shares broad market ETFs have very low slippage compared to active funds. You'll often see getting in and out of active funds, you might pay 25 basis points or 30 or even 50 basis points to get in and out. These ETFs generally have 4 or 5 basis point slippage. So STW, VAS and A200 all have about 4 basis point slippage, which is fantastic and nothing you'd need to worry about. You know that during market hours you can get in and out at a really great price. The MVW one, because it has a lot more small caps in there, has higher slippage because they obviously have to go and then make sure that they can get that underlying access to those small cap holdings at 10 basis points, but still pretty good slippage, all things considered. Then when it comes to liquidity, all of these ETFs trade a large value per day compared to a lot of other ETFs. Interestingly, over the last month, the one with the highest liquidity was actually the IOZ ETF, which is the iShares version. This was a bit of an anomaly because there was a bit of institutional trading happening in that month, and that's how they managed to tick up almost $28 million of liquidity. Generally, though, what we see is the Vanguard ETF has the highest monthly liquidity. In the last month, it was $22 million of turnover. And that is a daily turnover. So that's a lot of money that's traded in these things every day, and you can be pretty confident you can get in and out of them really easily. And the final metric is returns. Now, obviously, for anyone investing into these ETFs, returns is an incredibly important factor to consider. What we've seen is actually quite similar returns between these ETFs over the last few years, not surprisingly, because the underlying indices that they follow are quite similar. Either the ASX 200 or the ASX 300. The VanEck one is a little bit different in that it follows its own slightly different equal weight index. So the highest returning fund over the last 5 years has been the Vanguard Australian Shares Index Fund. It's returned 11.2% per year for 5 years, which is a fantastic return, and shows why these ETFs are so appealing, because it is better than the average active fund over that time. The smallest return at the moment has actually been the VanEck Equal Weight ETF, and that's because large caps have actually outperformed small caps over that period of time. However, if you wind back a few years, that VanEck ETF had actually performed quite well. And so when you invest in that equal weight ETF, you're taking a bit of a bet that you think that the small caps are going to do better than the big caps. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. It is a bit of a gamble you're taking when you're investing in that ETF. And the A200 ETF has had very similar returns over the last few years, but it hasn't been around for 5 years yet, so it doesn't have a 5-year track record. So overall, the one that we've had as our pick for clients since 2014 has been the Vanguard ETF. We love that it gives a slightly broader exposure to the ASX 300 rather than the 200. And even though it doesn't make a lot of difference because it only changes about 2% or 3% of the weights, it still gives you slightly broader diversification. We love its large size. It's got 8.8 billion under management, and that's growing exponentially. We like that it has a low tracking error, low slippage, good liquidity, and it has a really consistent return history. The index that it follows, the ASX 300, has been around for 21 years, so you can have a lot of confidence that that index is a great one to follow. And that's why we've recommended VAS. It's a core holding for all of our portfolios, and we love that these ETFs provide fantastic, low-cost diversified access to the Aussie market.